of our history reading for this week, which is the first American president. So if you got the history packet, you have something that looks like this, and we read chapter 23, The New Country, in my last video. If you did not watch that video, you should go find it. And then this time I'm going to be reading the first American president and talking about it a little bit, because you're supposed to have someone read it to you. I know some of you guys can read this on your own. Most of you can probably make your way through it, but it's got a lot of words. It's not written at a third grade level. So I really wanted to get to read it to you so that you can kind of talk with me while we're going through it. So we are on page 223. The section has a little arrow at the top, and it says the first American president. After the Constitutional Convention was over, George Washington went home. He'd had to be tired. He was almost 60 years old. He'd fought in the French and Indian War. He'd led the War for Independence, or the American Revolution. Now he wanted to stay on his farm in Virginia, feed his animals, work in his garden, and sit with his wife in front of the fireplace on the long, quiet evenings. But the people who had signed the Constitution begged George Washington to become the first president. Many Americans were nervous. They were afraid the president would soon become a king. And they knew that George Washington would never try to be the king of America. But George Washington didn't want to be the king of America. He didn't even want to be president. It is my great and sole desire to live and die in peace and retirement in my own farm, George Washington told Alexander Hamilton. But George Washington also believed that he had a duty to the people of the United States. If they wanted him to be president, he would have to accept. To accept means to agree to do something. So if they wanted him to be president, he said, well, I guess I'm going to have to say yes. Though I don't really want to say yes, I will say yes. The first elections for a president of the United States were held in February of 1789, and Washington won unanimously. Now, two things. The first elections were held in 1789, and we are getting ready to have elections this fall. It's 2020. So this is a fun subtraction problem. You're going to take 2020 minus 1789 and tell me how long have we been having elections for, okay? If you get the answer, you should text it to me or email it to me. And it also says unanimously. When someone wins something unanimously, it means that everybody agreed. So nobody voted against George Washington. Everybody voted for him. And as he had promised, he accepted the job of first president. But he wrote in his diary, I begin the presidency with more anxious and painful sensations than I have words to express. He was worried that he would do a good job. Washington had to ride to New York to be sworn in or inaugurated as president. He was hoping for a quiet journey. But every time he got near a town, people ran out and cheered, little girls threw flowers, men took off their hats, church bells were ringing. And when he rode through Philadelphia, he had to parade underneath arches built just for his honor. Finally, he arrived in New Jersey, where a barge, which is a big flat boat, would take him across the water to New York. He found the dock covered with a red carpet, soldiers standing at attention all along it. The barge he would ride on was covered with flags, rowed by 13 men. Each one of the men represented one of the states. As the barge pulled away from the dock, a whole parade of ships fell into line behind it. A Spanish warship with its crew cheering, a floating choir. So that means a group of people on a ship, all singing. They were all singing songs in honor of Washington. And dozens of small ships followed behind, filled with cheering Americans. The barge docked near Wall Street. When Washington stepped onto New York streets, he saw the roofs and sidewalks lined with people shouting his name. Little boys in the branches of the trees screamed, hurrah, hurrah! Some people fainted. I have seen him! One woman yelled. I would fall down on my knees before him. Washington was taken to the city hall in a coach surrounded by soldiers. Standing on a second-floor balcony where all the crowd could see him, He laid his hand on a Bible and took the first oath of office. I solemnly swear, Washington announced, that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. God bless our Washington, the crowd shouted. Long live our beloved president. Bands played music, fireworks exploded in the sky, and George Washington had to walk back to the house where he was staying because there were so many people that his coach couldn't get through. Too much traffic. Washington was so embarrassed and frightened by all this. He said, I fear they expect too much of me. But he had a vice president, John Adams, and Washington started on the huge job of governing the United States. In his first week as president, he had 718 soldiers, 75 post offices, and a few clerks. Clerks are like helpers. There was no other government. He had to build the government from nothing. So he chose 4 helpers, secretaries, to help him run the country. Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury, which means he was in charge of all the money. Thomas Jefferson became Secretary of State, so he was going to help him run the country. Washington also chose a Secretary of War that would be in charge of the Army and the Navy, and finally an Attorney General who would help him understand and follow the Supreme Court's decisions. These 4 men were known as the President's Cabinet. Now, cabinet we think of today as being like a place that you keep your dishes, right? Like I keep all my cups in the cabinet. But this kind of cabinet is a group of men that helps the president. Washington hired almost 1,000 people to help with all of the jobs, running post offices. Even there were jobs that he hired people for to keep the lighthouses lit. He signed an act declaring that the United States would have a new capital city. None of the states wanted to have a city in another state to become the capital, because then that state would feel more important than all the rest. So Washington convinced Virginia and Maryland to give up a little bit of the land that was between them. This land, the District of Columbia, would be the new location of a capital city. Congress would meet there, the Supreme Court would meet there, the president would live there. It would be like a little city just for the government, but it is not its own state. The cornerstone for the president's new house was laid in 1792 in the District of Columbia. Eventually, this president's house would become known as the White House, and a lot of you drew your White House pictures last week. It would have 132 rooms and 35 bathrooms. It's crazy. George Washington certainly seems to be like a king. Parades, all these people marching, the lady fainting, a house with 35 bathrooms. He had picked everybody in the new government. They even sang a song for him at his inauguration that was sung to the tune of God Save the King. The plans for the house looked like a palace. And guess what they named the new city? Washington, D.C., which is what it's still named today. But George Washington did not try to become a king. Congress suggested that maybe they should call him His Exalted High Mightiness or His Highness the President. Well, Washington didn't want any of that. He simply went by Mr. President. And he only wanted to be president for 4 years because the job was so hard. His hands got rheumatism, his hair turned white. He just wanted to go back to his farm. So at the end of his 4-year term, the people of America voted for him to be president again, even though he didn't run. So he didn't even try to become president, but they made him president again. Washington agreed. Fine. You guys want me to be president? I'll be president. He agreed to serve one more 4-year period or term. But then he refused. He said, I won't be president after this. I did 4 years. I did another 4 years. I'm not doing anymore. He knew that America didn't need a president holding power for life. He wanted the Constitution to be the ruler of the land, not the president. So Washington walked away from the power of the presidency, something no European king had done. And when he heard the news, George III of England, who was the guy they'd been fighting against, marveled and said, wow, he is the greatest character of the age. The end. Now, I have more videos for you to watch about George Washington, but George Washington set something we call a precedent, means he established a way for people to do things that all presidents have done, for the most part, since